Welcome to the Faith Trends Podcast, conversations that connect research with ministry.
If you've ever winced inside when someone asked you, "How big is your church?" you won't want to miss this episode of the Faith Trends Podcast. Today we'll be talking with pastor and author Karl Vaters about his new book, De-Sizing the Church, how church growth became a science, then an obsession, and what's next. And stick around for the after conversation when my co-host Lindsay Calloway and I talk about what we've heard from Karl.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Karl. You know, I was thinking about the interaction with your work that I've had to date. And here at the EFC, we did a research study on small churches in Canada. And I think if bibliographies were arranged by frequency of reference instead of alphabetical order, your book, Small Church Essentials, would have been at the top of the list. So
thank you.
Yeah, it was very helpful. So, you know, we know that you're well-versed on the topic of the small church, and you've written several books on the small church. Where did your recent book, De-Sizing the Church, start? Why did you write this one?
Yeah, like you say, for several years now, I've been helping small church pastors, trying to encourage them and helping to give them small church specific resources. But as I continue in this field and I look around and I go, everywhere we go, we're obsessed with bigness. It occurred to me a couple years ago, this had to have come from somewhere. Nothing comes from nowhere. And as researchers, you know that. So I thought, I'm going to do the research on this. So it actually started with a conversation I had with Gary McIntosh, who wrote the biography of Donald McGavran, who's considered the pioneer of the church growth movement. And in the conversation I had with him on another podcast, he and I were the two guests, he mentioned that Donald McGavran's idea behind church growth is almost 180-degree opposite to what we turned it into. Because I had put all the quote-unquote blame on McGavran because he's the name that was always attached to church growth. And so I thought to this concept of chasing bigness. So I thought, okay, there's something there. So I did the research. I dived into history of the church growth movement. It turned out to be a large history of the United States of America to a large degree as well. And I started to discover where bigness came from and why it's so dangerous for us. So that was the genesis of why I dug into this to begin with.
That's so interesting. And so could you tell us a little bit, what was McGavran's big idea? And then how did that get changed by contact with American culture?
Yeah, the McGavran story is fascinating. Donald McGavran was a missionary in India, in fact, a son of missionaries in India. So his entire upbringing was in India, even though he was an American missionary. So American citizen, but Indian culture, really. And as he was getting into his midlife in India, he started hearing reports of entire villages coming to Christ en masse. And at first he thought, well, that's just crazy talk. This has got to be, hyped by the time it gets to me. But he was a researcher, so he went to these villages and found out these are legitimate revivals. And like everybody in the town is legitimately following Christ with a thorough understanding of who Jesus is. And he went to town after town and found this. And so he thought, I got to figure out how this happens because there's something going on here that the Lord is doing. And if we can tap into that, then we can really do some amazing things in the kingdom of God. So he did the research on it. And then he was getting close to retirement and he was beginning to write his book. And on his way back to America to retire, he did a tour in Africa where similar things were happening in multiple countries in Africa. He came back to Yale University, which was his alma mater. He finished up his book. It became entitled The Bridges of God. And it was the idea of how do we make these bridges between people and God? What has God designed in his word and in us as those who are made in his image to be drawn unto him? And he published it. And in that book, for the first time ever, the terms church growth and homogeneous unit principle and some of the other common language that is used in the church growth principle appeared for the first time. He created these ideas. He then started the Church Growth Institute at Fuller University in California, which is where I live. He started that when he was 67 years of age. For the next 7 or 8 years, it became the center of church growth. Here's what's really fascinating, and this is what Gary McIntosh helped me with. For the first 6 or 7 years, he set it up so that there would be no American pastors in the class. Now, he couldn't straight out say, okay, if you're an American, you can't come to the class. There's problems with that. But he set it up with requirements that would exclude 99% of American pastors. You had to be proficient in a second language. You had to have worked in a cross-cultural context. You have to have an acknowledged expertise in another cultural context outside of your own. And so it ended up being almost all pastors from other nations. But his ideas were so strong and his book was catching on so much that they kept banging on his door going, "You got to let us in." And so when he was 82, I believe, 82, 83, he and C. Peter Wagner started the first class in 1974. They had the first class that allowed American pastors in. And that class at Fuller Institute is considered the spark point for the church growth movement. Out of that, everything exploded. And what happened was everything he dreaded that American pastors would do, and I'm speaking as a Canadian-born but American pastor myself. So everything that he feared American pastors would do with his ideas, we did. And it became something completely opposite of what he expected, which we can get into to whatever depth you would like to.
So you've mentioned that you're American, born in Canada.
Right.
But, in your book, you talk about important American evangelical leaders. You mentioned Jonathan Edwards, Charles Finney, D.L. Moody, Amy Semple McPherson. And how did these figures maybe shape the church today? How do you think they've contributed to the bigness problem? And maybe actually we should define why bigness is a problem first.
Yeah, let's start with that. In my book, I'm very, very clear to say church growth is not a problem. The growth of the church is something Jesus said he would do. He said,
Right.
I will build my church. So I'm not going to in any way obviously oppose the growth of the church because that's what Jesus is doing and has been doing relentlessly for 2,000 years and counting. The problem is bigness. Up until very, very recently, with a handful of exceptions in certain places in Europe where they had grand cathedrals, back in the day, until very recently, church size was not even a thing we talked about. I went through Bible college in the early 1980s, and I didn't have a single class where how to make your church bigger was even in the mix of the conversation. It was never about size. And 5 years after I came out, everything was about how to make it bigger. This was part of what I did for my research. Where did this come from? And fascinatingly, this obsession with bigness comes from American history. It comes all the way back to the founding of America, particularly the First Amendment, separation of church and state. What a lot of us don't realize is that in the European countries that settled America and Canada, that people came from, most of those European countries had not just state churches, but collected state church taxes. So when you paid your taxes, you also paid your tithes to the government, who then distributed it to the churches. So in Europe, churches were paid either through the government or through their denomination. And so they just continued to do church and their bills were paid. In America, the First Amendment says, okay, not only will we not restrict what you teach and what you preach and what religion you hold, which is a good thing, but that also means we ain't paying for it. Right? And most of us in America and Canada have no idea that ever happened. It turns out it still happens today. Denmark and a couple other countries in Europe, Germany, still collect state church taxes. Today, still, some of them do. And of course, we in America and Canada have never done that. So that means if you want to have a successful, quote unquote, church, the more people you have, the more money you get, the bigger you can build the church. And so it all started as an unintended negative byproduct of a positive thing, freedom of speech and separation of church and state.
Very interesting. Now, thinking through from that time, from the founding, obviously you're thinking from an American context, but so how has evangelicalism maybe contributed then to the growing problem of bigness through the revivalist movements and so on through the modern era?
Right. Yeah. Finney, Moody, Semple McPherson, and so on. That was your question. And I'm still on the on-ramp to get there. Thank you for reminding me of that. Yeah. So what you had is the first and second Great Awakenings, and then some would tag onto that the third Great Awakening, and I would call it the third Great Awakening as well. So the first and second one were folks like Wesley and so on, and Jonathan Edwards, the barnstorming preachers of way back then. But the third Great Awakening, which is often not labeled that, but again, I do, had folks like Moody and Amy Semple McPherson. And it really goes back to Charles Finney. Finney was the first one who really didn't just draw a crowd, but codified how to draw a crowd.
Yeah, the revival lectures.
Yeah, here are the processes that bring a large crowd in. And then we jumped on that. And then Moody really popularized things like the altar call. And then you had Amy Semple McPherson, this extraordinarily brave Canadian woman who traveled from New York to California. In the biography, Sister Amy, I can't remember who wrote it, but it's a brilliant biography. He notes that Amy Semple McPherson was the first solo female to drive across America in a car by herself. She did it when she drove from New York to California and established Angelus Temple, which easily, I think, could be labeled the first megachurch back in the 1920s. Became a hugely famous person, including having Hollywood stars like Charlie Chaplin coming to her Sunday services and being amazed by her showmanship. And so when these folks came in and a greater sophistication came in, and then they started writing about how we're doing these things, people then picked up their biographies and their instructions and started duplicating these methods and these processes in other places. And so you had the beginning of the large churches coming. So that American stream coalesced in the 1980s with the burgeoning McGavran stream, which was actually trying to do something very different than that. But they all came together and coalesced into this one big thing. So basically what happened was this American relentlessness towards bigger got unintended cover and language from the McGavran stream and got some legitimacy from the research in the McGavran stream. And it became this single thing that most people didn't know was actually two things that weren't meant to go together that got melded together.
And when we're thinking about the church growth movement and the way it became, like the subtitle for your book talks about how it began as a science and then became an obsession. What were sort of the principles of the church growth movement, not as McGavran intended, but in the way that it came to be practiced?
Yeah, let me give you a couple. First of all, Donald McGavran, as I said, this didn't come from America. His stuff came from India and Africa. And it didn't come from somebody trying to make churches bigger. It came from somebody recognizing entire cities are coming to Jesus. Entire villages are coming to Christ at the same time. So it was never about building larger churches. It was about people movements coming to Jesus. It was about increasing the percentage of Christians in a given population, not about Christians coalescing into larger clumps of people in bigger churches. So that was the first thing. Church growth to him was not individual congregations getting bigger. Church growth to him was Christians increasing as a percentage of the population. He knew, however, if we got his ideas, Americans would turn it into a big church contest. And again, I'm speaking as an American citizen. And that's what we did. So that was the first thing. Even the word church growth, he meant something different than we have made it to be. The second one was what I referenced earlier, the homogeneous unit principle. Homogeneous unit principle I was introduced to, got to be 20 years ago, and it was through things like where a church would create an avatar of their target market person, right? It's going to be a person who looks like this, who's driven in business, who's really super busy, and who's got this much income and so on, right? And that's our target. And we're going to get people who look like that because the idea was people want to worship with people who look and act and sound like themselves. And I thought, that's not good. Right? This idea of everybody looking and sounding the same kind of sounds to me like the opposite of what Revelation tells us is going to be in heaven from every tribe and tongue and nation. And we're all going to sit with people who look more like us. I mean, this is just reinforcing what, Martin Luther King decried so many years ago, that 11 o'clock on Sunday is the most segregated hour of the week. And I thought this is a problem. And I blame McGavran because he coined the term. But as I read about McGavran in recent years for this book, I discovered his homogeneous unit principle came this way. I'll make a complex subject as simple as I can because I'm a simple guy. He was in India. And in India, there's a caste system that as Americans and Canadians, we can't even begin to comprehend. But it is stratified into something like 20 or more castes. And castes are, to our mind, it's something like socioeconomic status. It's way deeper than that. But you got the rich people on the top, the poor people on the bottom. And these castes are stratified to where if you are in a caste below someone, you are not allowed to talk to them. And if you're a caste above someone else, they are considered dirt beneath your feet. And I'm probably even stereotyping and misunderstanding the Indian subcontinent with this because I just don't have it's so different from me. But there is a caste system there. And McGavran, living in it, realized if an American or a Canadian goes into India and tells people about Christ and somebody comes to Christ from that, they, in their caste system, think, oh, becoming a Christian means becoming an American or a Canadian. Or if someone from a different caste shares Christ with them, they think, oh, becoming a Christian means becoming a member of their caste. And that's something I'm incapable of doing. It's like being Irish and telling somebody, oh, I'm now going to become Italian. Well, you can't. You are what you are. So he thought, okay, what we need to do is we need to teach people how within their caste to share with others in their caste and to let them know that becoming a Christian doesn't mean that you betray your culture. So in fact, homogeneous unit principle of caste members sharing Christ with people within their caste so that you don't have to lose your cultural identity was in fact anti-racist. It was supposed to bring people together and for people. And then once you've got people in multiple castes coming to Christ, they look around and go, we have far more in common through Christ than we have through our caste. And it breaks down those barriers. And it became the opposite of that. It became siloing us into even tighter demographic groups. And that was never the original intention. So that's just two ideas of how this language got completely transformed into something that was never intended.
Now, when we're talking about bigness, reading in your book, there's more to it than just McGavran, right? You talk a little bit about the influence of the suburb and how that also shaped our ideas about what church should be. And how did the fact of the suburb or being a suburb change the way we do church?
Yeah. I found this by mistake. I did not expect that I'd have an entire chapters on how the suburbs came about in a book about church. But it plays such a huge role, as you know, from reading it. So here's what happened. For generations in North America and in the world, people lived within their communities, and the only people they knew or had any really understanding of were the people who were physically in the room with them, or physically in the town with them, or physically on the farm with them, or physically coming into their stores. And so we had a very narrow view of the world. The Great Migration in the late 1800s to early 1900s had factories being built in large cities. And so you had people moving from agricultural communities into big cities. But the big cities didn't have the infrastructure to handle the massive influx of people that were coming to places where they were building cars and where they were having steel mills and so on, and these massive factories. And so you ended up with massive poverty, with people jammed into places with horrific living conditions, with filth running through the streets. And the cities became cesspools to support factories because the cities didn't have the infrastructure. As this infrastructure started to develop, things like rail cars and then automobiles, and then the railways and the roads and highways to support them, people now realized, hey, I've got some mobility here, especially once the automobile came in and the interstate highways came in, and like the Trans-Canada Highway, which I've driven almost every mile of, by the way. When those came in, people started realizing, hey, I can do my half-hour commute not just in half a mile to a mile that I can walk, but I can do a half-hour commute way out to this new development of brand new homes just outside the city. And my family can live in this beautiful new place, and I'll just drive into the city to do my work and then leave. And so that happened. The move to the suburbs in the 50s and 60s was huge. And then what happened is the churches followed these people into the suburbs, but now you've got a very different dynamic. The church is not now in the neighborhood and the entire family is walking to church with other people in their neighborhood going to the same church. You now have mom and the kids stereotypically in the suburbs, dad doing a daily migration called the commute now back and forth. And on Sunday, dad comes home and dad's exhausted because dad's not just been working, but his dad has also been migrating, commuting an hour or more every single day. And some of them just stopped going to church. Or when the churches did get built, they looked around and said, you know what's really attracting people in these suburbs? Those malls. Let's make our churches look like those malls. Let's put in parking like the malls. Let's put in departments like the malls. And the development of the suburbs and the development of the shopping mall vastly influence the physical locations and the physical layout of our churches. And then the physical layout around us influences how we perceive where we are. If you go to a church that looks and feels like a shopping mall, you feel like a consumer. And this is all subconscious. And we've been doing it enough now that I think we can look back with some objectivity and hopefully some kindness and hopefully some helpful critique to say, here's why we are in the place where people feel like consumers, because we built churches that look like malls.
Wow.
So in many ways, desizing the church is about the church growth movement, but we've said it earlier and it bears repeating that you are talking about two quite different streams of church growth. Yeah. And one you like better than the other. So what are some other ways that maybe this new conception of the church growth movement went sideways, I think is how you put it. You mentioned some things in your book like celebrity culture and this maybe obsession with measuring everything. Could you talk about those factors?
Yeah. And just for everybody who's listening, to balance it out, I have one chapter on what the church growth movement got right. And I believe the church growth movement, even as combined with the American stream, did some things really, really well. It helped us to look outside of our own denominations. It helped us to share these ideas with others. It did a lot of very good things. But yeah, some of the ways that it went sideways are really worth noting. And you brought up the celebrity culture, which I think is one of the biggest ones. Years ago, back in the era of Finney and Moody and so on, there was only a certain amount of fame that you could obtain because the only way you were going to be known was maybe in a newspaper that took a while to print or in a book that took even longer to print. And then it kind of disappeared from consciousness. And so you have a handful of folks who had big impact that we know, like a Finney or a Moody, but you had a whole lot of other people who became kind of local or regional famous, whose names we have completely forgotten. And then film came in, radio came in, and television came in. And now you are not limited. The size of your church and the size of your audience is no longer limited to the people you can physically get into a room anymore. It's only limited by the number of people who have a radio or who have a television. And today with the internet, it's virtually limitless. It's limited to the literal size of the globe that you can become famous. And the speed at which you can become famous is massively accelerated. And so now we all know, of course, about people who are super famous, and we scratch our heads and go, but for what? Like they've mastered getting their face out there, but you really scratch your heads to wonder, but famous for what? Famous for being famous, kinda. And if you marry the ability to become famous for being famous with the idea that a bigger church is better than a smaller church, that's a dangerous combination. All of a sudden, well, they must be doing something right. Look at all the viewers they've got. Well, not necessarily, because as we know, there's a lot of people out there who have a lot of viewers who are doing hurtful things. I'm not talking about pastors necessarily. I'm talking about, just general celebrities who are doing horrific things and living horrible lives and are being really bad examples, but become super famous on YouTube. And that has seeped also into the church, so that now, simply because of the size of the audience, which now is virtually limitless, we've created celebrities who have an influence and an impact on our lives, who we will never be able to know close enough to know, are they true to their word and are they actually people of integrity? And then, of course, what we've seen over the last few years is it seems like almost every 2 weeks, there's another name of another pastor or a well-known ministry leader that we have looked up to and that we have seen as an example, who turn out to not just have feet of clay, but in fact to have horrific sins that they have been hiding for so many years that eventually do come out. And then that erodes trust and everything else. So one of the dangers of bigness is not only does it increase our reach, but it increases the dangers when there is something wrong going on the inside, when we're not presenting ourselves with integrity.
Character seldom survives fame and fortune.
Seldom. Or, well, let's say lack of character seldom survives fame and fortune. Character will get you through. Lack of character is what will be exposed by it. So, yeah.
Yeah. So up until this point, Karl, we've been talking about the sizing of the church, and your book is about desizing the church. So let's get to the hopeful stuff. How do we go about desizing the church?
The two really key turning point chapters in the book, I'll give them to you, and then I'll give you a quick outline of what they are. The first one is integrity is the new competence. And the second one is discipleship fixes everything. So I love it when I stumble on a little phrase like that kind of puts things poignantly. I don't get there very often, but I got there with those 2 chapter titles, so I'm happy with them. The first one is Integrity is the New Competence. For 40 plus years throughout the church growth movement, we have been teaching technique. We've been teaching methods. We've been teaching procedures. When somebody discovers a new technique or method or procedure, they're very generous and they pass it on. And I mean that sincerely. They are generous with passing it on. And I'm grateful for that. That's one of the positives of the church growth movement is we have more tools in our tool belts than we used to have. However, while we've been teaching technique, we have assumed integrity. And as we've seen in recent years, we can't assume integrity anymore. And in fact, part of the toxicity of bigness is the success of our techniques blinds us to the toxicity of the lack of integrity. We need to come back to the point where we value integrity more than we value technique, and where we teach integrity as a competence that you can learn, just like we've been teaching technique as a competence that you can learn. It needs to be brought that foremost to the front of things, because you can get a crowd with technique, but you cannot sustain viable ministry with only technique and without integrity. We have to be the same people at home as we are in the pulpit or online. And so we've got to come back to integrity again. So that's the first step. The second step, discipleship fixes everything. Think about this. Just pause for a moment and ask yourself, can you think of a major problem that a church could have that discipleship doesn't fix? I've been thinking about this for years and I can't come up with one, right? Lack of finances, discipleship will fix that. Lack of maturity, discipleship will fix that. Sinfulness in the camp, discipleship will fix that, right? You can go through the list of things. The only thing discipleship will not fix is the size of your church. One, because the size of your church is not a problem to fix. So we got to get that out of our heads. Big churches and small churches both have value. We've got this thing in our head that if a church has stayed at, let's say, 80 people for years, we call that what word? Stuck. In a recent poll, they discovered in the churches they surveyed, 1/3 of them are growing numerically, 1/3 of them are staying about the same zone numerically, and 1/3 of them are decreasing numerically. And the headline was, 2/3 of churches are in decline or stuck. But who says that the 1/3 of churches that are maintaining their numbers numerically are stuck? Maybe that's the size they're supposed to be. Maybe that's the size at which they work best. You could have written the headline as 2/3 of churches are maintaining or growing. But it depends on your view of numbers. And I know of a lot of churches, the church that I've served for 31 years, for instance, we've sustained our numerical size within a window for a long period of time, but we are a massively effective church in reaching our community. Part of the reason we've sustained at the same number rather than grown substantially is we've got a hugely transitional congregation. We've got to grow by about 25% per year just to replace the people who leave every year because they move, because we live in a transitional place. So those kinds of things happen all over the place. So we really have to rethink what we perceive about size and about stuckness. So discipleship won't fix the size of your church because size isn't a problem to fix. The size that your church is right now, God can use right now. Now, might it cause numerical increase if God blesses it? Yes. But the second part of discipleship fixes everything, and why bigness isn't a problem to fix. First of all, bigness isn't a problem to fix. Secondly, it won't fix the size of your church, because sometimes if we really double down on discipleship and we require the commitment from people that biblical discipleship requires of them, you may have a bit of an exodus for a while. And there will be times when you will have a decision, and the decision will be, do this thing and you will become big, or do this other thing to maintain discipleship. And there will be times when you have to make a decision between, do I do the thing that has integrity and that makes deep discipleship, or do I do the crowd building thing that will potentially even undermine discipleship and will maybe steal members from another church or present myself as something that I'm not, and that'll get the numbers up, but it's not integrity. There are times when being a person of integrity and following the hard path of discipleship will actually be a hindrance to numerical increase.
Thank you so much, Karl. If you're interested, to our listeners, in Karl's book, Desizing the Church, How Church Growth Became a Science, Then an Obsession, and What's Next, we'll include a link in the show notes. But Karl, if people are interested in following your work, how can they do that?
Yeah, the easiest thing is to go to karlvaters.com, as long as you spell my name right. First name with a K, last name with a V, and it's a T in the middle of Vaters, not a D. It's not Star Wars. So you go to karlvaters.com, or you can find me, Karl Vaters, on pretty much any social media that's out there as well.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. Good to be with you.
Rick, I'm so thankful for Karl and the work that he's done in this book. I quite enjoyed the read, and I think what really stuck out to me was what he was getting at the end, was this emphasis and sort of this calling the church to focus on integrity over technique. I'm curious, though, how we teach integrity. Obviously, I'm raising young children, and I'm trying to think through some of these things, and he said it needs to be something that we teach like a technique. Consider it sort of a competency that ministry leaders should maybe leave their training with. So do you have any ideas? How do we teach integrity?
Boy, it's a very hard question. I think that a lot of our Christian teaching comes out of the conversations that we have. We've just done some research as well on how parents disciple their children in the home. And, it's always, people are talking about modeling versus teaching, and I think both go there. I always keep coming back to the idea that whatever we learn, that it is really processed in conversation with each other. I remember years ago, Willow Creek did some research, and they discovered that, and this was a church growth church, they discovered that their discipleship was very shallow, and they wanted to know what they could do about it. So they did a study. And I think one of the things that they found was that when people studied the Bible and talked about what it meant for their lives, that this is kind of where they saw the greatest kind of spiritual growth. And I don't know if that's exactly the integrity like we're talking about, but I think that there is something in that social processing of Scripture about the things that we experience in our faith, where that really starts to shape a character. And I would think that we need to start rewarding integrity as well. I know that you come from a pastoral family, and I pastored a church, and many times at our district conferences, what they will do is they will platform the church and the pastor with the greatest growth. And it is numerical growth, and you seldom see someone platform for integrity, for the way that, for instance, they work through a schism in their church, for the way that they dealt with someone who threatened them financially, or any other kinds of things that pastors will experience. And so how do we reward that? How do we recognize that, or at least not undermining it by suggesting that it's not important through the things that you do sort of reward and celebrate?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And as you said, coming from a pastoral family, I think some of those things you mentioned would be really valuable to hear from practitioners about. And, I was also thinking, what is stopping us from processing things in community? When I think about that, that seems, obviously, I get to hop on a Zoom call with you during work hours, and I can kind of run things by you, and I speak with my husband, but I think there's a lot of people who feel quite stuck. They don't know who to ask. And so it's easier to maybe reach out as an anonymous person online, or to just kind of maybe Google a question that you have, rather than actually reaching out to people and having those conversations. Do you think there's something about the way our culture, or even our churches, are structured that are barriers maybe to having these conversations with other people?
I think in an analogous way to what Karl was talking about when he said that, our suburbs shaped us, I think that the new suburbs is the online world, whether it's the internet or social media. And I think that one, social media just doesn't allow for those kinds of conversations because social media is all about exclusion and embrace, right? You're either good or you're a goat. And goat is not the greatest of all time. I'm a little bit old. Goat used to mean something bad. But we don't have the time for each other, and we don't have the safe spaces to have those kinds of conversations. And I think that there's a real opportunity for churches to become those places. But I think that people are going to have to see the kinds of conversations that are valuable. And I don't know how you seed that so that they want to perpetuate them and enter into them. And I think that this will be valuable, and we're going to have to do it if we do want to become the kind of churches of integrity.
Thanks for listening to this intentionally ad-free podcast. Find out more about the EFC's research and how you can support it with a donation at theefc.ca/research.